Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, a fellow at the Foundation. Today is April 3rd, 2025, and I'm delighted to be here again with Ahmed Moor. Ahmed is a Palestinian-American writer born in Gaza and a 2025 fellow at FMEP. He's an advisory board member of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, co-author of After Zionism, published by Saqi Books, and is currently writing a book about Palestine. Last week, he published a powerful piece in The Guardian entitled "There are more child amputees in Gaza than anywhere else in the world. What can the future hold for them?" For which he conducted many interviews, including with Gazan child amputees and their families. Ahmed, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Peter. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for speaking with me about the story.
Sure. So this is obviously an extremely grim subject and painful subject. Maybe you could just tell me a little bit for folks who have not read the Guardian article, although I would highly recommend that they do, what you found when you started investigating this question in Gaza.
So it's a big topic. I mean, as you know, as you highlighted, Gaza is now home to the highest concentration of child amputees in the world. Um, I'd like to say something like probably in the history of the world, but that's a hard claim to qualify or justify. Um, the first question that comes to mind is why? You know, is it the ordinance? Is it the particular way in which the Israelis are waging their campaign? I've spoken, I probably spoke with about 25 people for this story, lots of doctors, operating staff at both PCRF and Heal Palestine. I didn't speak with anybody at the Israeli coordinator, Kogat, which oversees civilian matters in the occupied territories. I couldn't speak with anybody at the World Health Organization either. But what emerged basically through my conversations with doctors is that amputation is it's almost a palliative effort or a life-saving effort. You may have injuries that in ordinary circumstances are treatable. A broken leg, for instance, not a life-threatening injury in ordinary circumstances. Or one doctor I spoke with talked to me about 15% wounds on a baby. And his quote, we didn't include this in the story, but his quote was, "No kid dies with 15% burns." But he was faced with a choice. Does he amputate that child's arms? Um, in unsanitary conditions, and he told me he didn't have any anesthetic either, um, or do nothing. And he opted to do nothing because in this case, an amputation in those unsanitary conditions with a lack of blood, with a lack of antibiotics, with a lack of painkillers would have probably led to the baby's death anyway. And so that child ended up dying of dehydration, which is a complication of a burn. In a normal hospital setting, you would administer painkillers and put that kid on an IV. And then maybe sometime down the line, a plastic surgeon would try to improve the range of motion and the appearance of the injury. And so that was my biggest learning here is that the amputations are really kind of a relatively direct and foolproof method of reducing the complexity of a wound, a shrapnel wound, a burn, whatever it may be, and also eliminating infection, which leads to death. So, it's really it's a tragic doesn't really capture it. I mean, this is all man-made stuff, right? The Israelis could flood Gaza with antibiotics today, with painkillers today, with life-saving surgical equipment today. This is kind of an orchestrated, in my view, orchestrated effort to make Gaza unlivable and to accelerate the ethnic cleansing. And kids, of course, are victims in all this.
So, right. So there's the combination of the severity of the injuries that people are experiencing because of Israeli attacks, and then the limitations on the care they can get for those injuries. So on the first part, do you have some sense of these children who then are so badly injured that these doctors are in this agonizing situation of deciding to amputate. Is that largely because they were in buildings that were bombed, or because they were shot close up, or like what are the kinds of attacks that have led to them being in such a severe injury that then this happens?
So again, I go back to the doctors who are the heroes in all of this,
Yeah.
and not just the Palestinian doctors who are absolutely heroes, but also the doctors like Dr. Mark Perlmutter and Dr. Feroz Sidwa and others, Dr. Ahmed, who I spoke with, who famously walked out of the meeting with Biden. These people are traveling to Gaza. We know that the deconfliction mechanism doesn't really work. It was a year ago that the Israelis killed the 7 World Central Kitchen workers. We know that the Israeli military is operating on pretty lax um, um, rules of engagement, and that the consequences for killing a foreign national are, you know, virtually non-existent. And so one of these, any one of these doctors who undertakes the personal risk of traveling to Gaza is looking at a situation in which they may be killed. And I don't think that's an exaggeration at this stage. So
It's
what
extraordinary.
I've
I
learned,
mean, just to stop, I mean, it's extraordinary. These are people mostly, I imagine, living fairly comfortable lives, right? In the West, in some, going to some normal hospital, 9 to 5, coming back to their suburban home, turning on their TV, eating a meal, and they're literally choosing out of moral obligation to, first of all, work under the most traumatizing and horrifying circumstances I could imagine, which I would imagine leaves them deeply, deeply traumatized, right? And leaving putting aside their normal lives, their families, whatever, which is in itself, something the vast majority of people would never, but then actually putting their lives also at grave risk.
that's 100% accurate. I mean, and there's not a single doctor I spoke with who wasn't traumatized. I mean, every one of these conversations mostly ended in tears. I mean, there's no processing in real time for these doctors. They're just working around the clock. And so to your question, I mean, no, the vast majority of the conversation I would have with these physicians is about death, is about children dying on the ICU floor, children dying on the gurney, children being operated on and then dying. It's overwhelmingly a story about death. And then the amputations are the rare instances. 3 to 4 thousand kids have survived an amputation in circumstances that in the most generous circumstances you wouldn't call third world today. Uh, and so no, the kids who are shot, they die. The kids who are crushed under rubble, mostly they die. The kids whose limbs are blown off, they also mostly die. Um, and I mean, in the story, I profile this family. It's astonishing to me that the kids that I met lived. I mean, the little they're between when the severe injuries were sustained and when they got to a real operating hospital was more than 24 hours. And you can imagine at that point a 3-year-old whose leg has been blown off, wearing a tourniquet, sitting in a stairwell for 24 hours. Um, that kid, like many, many thousands of other kids that we know about, was looking at a very different outcome. Um, And so again, the story, the child amputees, it's important, extremely important. It is it's the minority of cases that turn out that way. Typically, kids just die. Um, and I was trying to get a handle of this on this. I spoke with a palliative care specialist, a handful of palliative care specialists, because kids die everywhere. It's one of the bleak realities of life everywhere. In the United States, kids die of cancer. Rarely kids die in car accidents. And I spoke with a palliative care specialist at CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is just down the street here. And I asked her about amputations, and she said, frankly, I don't know about amputations. I don't see amputations.
Wow.
If you have a car accident and a 5-year-old is severely injured, we have the medical technology, we have the capabilities, we have the blood banks. That child is going to be triaged, and the limb's going to be saved. In most cases, that's going to happen. Again, kids don't lose limbs in America. They don't lose limbs in Europe. That's not what happens. Um, and so that was another feature of all this is that, again, like the dramatic incidence of traumatic force injuries alone doesn't explain the reality.
Right, 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 right. So you're saying that really even right. I mean that if the medical system in Gaza were functioning, that obviously huge numbers of people would be killed because of Israel's massive assault, but that the people who didn't die would be able to would probably not have these amputations.
That's right. I mean that's exactly it. I mean, one of the doctors told me, and I quoted it, typically, a physician may choose to tolerate an infection in a patient in order to preserve a limb because with penicillin, it's an old technology at this point. You
Hmm.
can battle an infection. It's not available in Gaza today.
Yeah. So we can just talk a little bit about what you learned about why that is, about how the rest is it, I mean, obviously the hospital is also being bombed, but is it mostly how much of it is because the healthcare infrastructure has been destroyed? How much of it is because of Israel's restrictions about what they allow in other factors?
So it's both. It's a combination of both. One doctor recounted to me, orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Mark Perlmutter, before the Rafah border was overrun, so patients would be evacuated through Rafah. And so, for people listening, geography of Gaza, you've got two border crossings with Israel in the north and the south. Um, and then you've got a border crossing with Egypt in the southwest. And so, the Rafah crossing. And when that was overrun by the Israelis in May 2024, they shut it down, basically. So before May 2024, doctors like Mark, he loaded up on 700 pounds of orthopedic material. So screws and plates and other things that he would be able to use for patients. And he told me, it was the amount of, and this is all kind of out of pocket expense. He
Wow.
loaded it in suitcases, paid the overage charge, flew to Cairo, took a taxi to with his colleagues to the border, and then managed to get everything in. And he went through that material in about a week. And he told me that it takes several months typically at his clinic in Carolina, I think North Carolina, to get through similar material. Um, that was before May 2024. Since the Israelis overran the border, physicians now traveling to Gaza have to go through Kerem Shalom, which is the border with Israel, southeastern Gaza. And they're prohibited from carrying anything beyond their personal use, basically. So they can take a toothbrush, they can take a little bit of toothpaste, they can take a little bit of hand sanitizer, as one doctor told me, because there's no soap in Gaza. Um, and so they're really limited. What is a doctor with no operating equipment in an unsanitary operating theater? Well, it's a guy with a hatchet. The restriction of material is an underemphasized, I'd say, feature of the story. Restriction of the access, because now the doctors have to go, if they go for 3 weeks now as opposed to 2 weeks. And at the start of the call, you emphasize that people are taking time away from their families, from their careers, from their children, their other obligations. And you can imagine by requiring the period that they're gone to be extended by 50%, you make it less possible for people to actually go. Um, And then, of course, is the destruction of the hospitals themselves. So one of the doctors told me, he said it's less true today, but in his first visit to Gaza, people were living in the hallways. They were cooking in the ICU. They were cooking in the operating rooms. So they were taking refuge, which is also what one of the families I profiled, that people would take refuges at the hospitals. And you can imagine the unsanitary conditions that prevail when you don't have running water, when basic sewage infrastructure has been destroyed, um, and people are cooking on open fires in the ICU. Bleak doesn't begin to describe it. And of course, one of the big dimensions of all this, the journalists today are the doctors. You and I are not allowed in Gaza, and the Israelis have killed more Palestinian journalists have killed more journalists in Palestine, in Gaza, than World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea uh, combined. And you may have seen this report that just emerged, highlighting that fact. So we don't really have eyes. We don't know beyond what these courageous Palestinian journalists in Gaza are telling us and losing their lives over. We don't know what's happening, and these doctors are conveying some of that information.
So just to go back, that when they were originally, before Israel took over the Rafah crossing, they were, and when like Dr. Perlmutter could take in these suitcases, that was because that was the Egyptians' decision. And now once Israel took it over, now it's Israel's decision about what people can take in.
Yeah, that's right. So before October 23, the Rafah border was managed by the civil authority, which in this case was Hamas, and 18 years ago was the Palestinian Authority. And then on the other side, there are Egyptians. Now, the Israelis have always had a presence, either actual or virtual presence at that border, monitoring what comes in and out. And that's why the smuggling tunnels were such a big story, 20 years or maybe 15 years ago. Um, and so the coordination that would occur still required the participation of the Israelis. So in order to get out of Gaza as an injured child, you get one guardian. You've got to first file a petition with whatever remains of the Palestinian Health Authority, which again is a body which has been mostly destroyed because it's affiliated with Hamas, as the Israelis put it. Um, Once you've filed your petition, then that goes to the World Health Organization, which coordinates with COGAT, the Israeli coordinator for the territories, the occupied territories, the military coordinator, and then the Egyptians as well. So there's this long chain of coordination. Never mind all the supporting, the money for the flights, the hospitals which donate millions of dollars of care here in the United States. And that was another thing, by the way, that none of the hospitals wanted to talk to me, understandably. And we live in a time where donating care to injured Palestinian children could cause you to be could cause your mission to be undermined because certain people don't like that kind of thing.
So the hospitals from where these doctors worked are basically worried that the Trump administration or some member of Congressman will go after them because they'll say they were supporting Hamas by basically allowing their doctor to go and treat children and other people in Gaza.
Well, no, I meant more that the children who are evacuated, who get
Mhm.
treated here in the United States,
Right.
they're receiving free medical care from
Oh, I
large
see. Oh,
hospital
I see.
systems that donate their
Oh,
services.
okay.
Again, like people have, their hearts are in the right place, but
Mm.
the repressive environment is such that you don't want the broader world to know that you've donated millions of dollars of care in New York and Philadelphia, wherever, to a
Treating a
Hamas
Palestinian.
affiliated toddler,
Right.
whatever
Right.
other, silliness.
Right, right. I see. Okay. Um, so basically to go back to when before May 2024, the Egyptian, even though Israel had some virtual presence at the Rafah crossing, it was mostly in Egypt's hands, and Egypt was more open about how much people could take in. But then when that's closed, they have to go through an Israeli checkpoint, which is tougher.
Precisely. And during the ceasefire, the border reopened briefly to evacuate, to allow, children to be evacuated more directly, to Egypt. But that's no longer the case now. So the Israelis, when they overran Rafah, they just closed the border.
Mm.
And so the chain became much more complicated because kids were being evacuated through Karam Abu Sadim, but I think it was a total of something like 13 kids that I learned about, as compared to a few hundred, I believe, before May 2024.
And
Um,
if they're evacuated through Kerem Shalom, then once they go across Kerem Shalom, they're in Israel. They're not in Egypt, right?
that's right. And so what happens there is they go a Palestine Red Crescent
mm,
ambulance loads them
mm,
up. They go
mm,
to Kerem Shalom.
mm.
They're forced to get out and walk. And I interviewed a family who this happened to. They get out and walk. They're searched. Um, they board another ambulance with a convoy, military convoy in Israel, are driven straight to the King Hussein crossing, which is, the crossing with Jordan between Egypt and, I'm sorry, between Jordan and Israel. And then from there, so the Allenby crossing for people who know it by
Right,
that name.
right.
And then from there, they go up to Amman, typically where they spent 24 hours at a government hospital before being evacuated to usually the
Okay.
US or somewhere in Europe.
I see. Okay,
But
okay.
that's a very rare, that doesn't happen very often.
Mm, mhm. Right.
Usually kids who are on these lists or who are waiting for that first, approval, tend to die.
And what is Israel's justification for how difficult it is for children to leave Gaza, especially given that it's not like they're hanging out in Israel, right? They're basically immediately being taken outside of Israel to Jordan and then other places, and how difficult it is for foreign doctors to come in with surgical equipment or other medical supplies.
I mean, this is where I'd have to get into kind of speculative
Yeah.
statements because I
Mm,
didn't speak with Kogat. I
mhm,
didn't speak with anybody in a position of authority on the Israeli side who could clarify why these
mm,
onerous conditions exist,
mm.
why these policies exist, because we are talking about policy. It's not some random guy who just feels who's got this kind of capricious take on
Right,
who should
right,
suffer that day.
right.
Um, I couldn't tell you what the official line is, but
Mm,
the perspective generally is let's make life hard. And that certainly accords with the statements that come out of the Israeli leadership's mouths. Katz saying, for instance, that we're proceeding with the Trump plan. Netanyahu, I mean, they've established a body now to facilitate the voluntary, and I put voluntary in air quotes there,
right.
transfer of the civilian population from Gaza. This is how you create genocidal conditions. This is what you do when you want, quote, voluntary transfer. Um, and so the next stage of the plan, they've made Gaza unlivable. And I remember a conversation that you and I had over a year ago, or yeah, when I was for the last thing I published for The Guardian in July 2024 well, you said, I don't know that there's a day after plan. Gaza's unlivable today. And that was a year ago when you and I had that conversation. And so the creation of these conditions seems, if you take the statements at face value, which I do, seems designed to make Gaza even more unlivable, and to drive the people out, those of them who survive. And so the next stage, according to Katz, the Israelis are going to create points of transfer, of exit, you know, to allow Palestinians who want to flee to flee. My question is, where are they going to go? Um, it's ethnic cleansing, it's genocide, and all of it seems organized around that principle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so for these kids who then have limbs amputated, I mean, life as an amputee is hard enough anywhere in the world. But what is that? I mean, I know that also there've been amputees in Gaza even before, October 7th, right? I mean, Israel has been, many previous bombings, and I know that there were a lot of amputees after when during the Great March of Return, a lot of people were shot by Israel and then they had to live in amputees. So what is that like, and what was it like to talk to parents who know their children are now gonna be, I mean, so hard for anyone in Gaza to survive, even someone who's completely able-bodied. Like, what were those conversations like?
I mean, they're difficult. It's a traditional society, and like lots of places, there's at least in my experience of it before now. There's stigma attached to disability. Marriageability is an important dimension of life in a traditional society. Um, and And you can imagine how all of that changes in an ordinary society in which amputations exist. I don't know, the fact that this has been done in such kind of a broad and thorough way. Like everybody's touched by this reality now in Gaza. I don't know what it does to the social fabric. I don't know how it reorients the society and really destroys some basic cultural elements. And I think that's one thing to kind of observe. And I don't know what 20 years out will look like. And then again, I'm talking about the social fabric, the culture. When you talk about the reality of an individual, one of the things I learned is trauma is attended by PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I spoke with a developmental specialist here in Philly, a guy who leads a large neuroscience lab, and one of the things, it's not like you get injured and you put on a prosthetic and then you learn to play soccer or run a marathon and suddenly life's okay. The proximate, the time, the incident which caused that injury leaves psychological wounds, and those need to be addressed as well. And the scale of that suffering, I think, hasn't been emphasized adequately. And we haven't had a chance to take a breath to emphasize it, right? I mean, it's still ongoing, it's still happening. Um, so what I was impressed by with Heal Palestine, the nonprofit that does a lot of this work, is that they're taking kind of a holistic approach to helping these children rebuild their lives.
Mm.
Um, the families are traumatized. I mean, the conversations with the parents, some of them were dissociative. They're just shell shocked. Um, you'd be in a room talking about a child, and I would, ask, should so and so go to the other room? Well, why? She was there when I put my hand, when her brother's brains were kind of, that little boy carried his brother and sister out of the stairwell, and so, and yeah, why? Well, what exactly am I gonna say, which is gonna
Right.
going in any way to but that question of re-traumatizing, that question of post-traumatic stress disorder was on my mind continuously. And then in most cases with the small kids, I didn't want to try to ask them about their injuries or relive it.
Right.
It was mostly
Right.
the adults.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, I think a lot of them are processing. One of the things that was true universally is all of the adults are bereaved. They've all lost a husband or more than one child, and they're struggling to kind of get through the day as well.
Yeah.
Um, and you had small kids at one point. I have small kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Days can be really grueling
Yes. Yes. Under the best
when
of circumstances. Yeah.
exactly. And so what do you do when it just it all of it is so I don't know how people are getting through it at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you talk? You obviously didn't talk to them about the most traumatic things. Did you talk to some kids, and what was that? What was that like when you actually talked to these kids who had limbs amputated?
There are some bright points. Like I met a little boy in Port Said, on the which is an Egyptian town at the end of the Suez Canal in the Mediterranean. And he was living with his mother, and his siblings and his father were still in Gaza, surviving siblings and father were still in Gaza. And his mother bought him a kitten, and they're getting support through Heal Palestine so that, to pay for the apartment. And she bought him a kitten, and we just, he told me about his kitten, and we played with the kitten, and he had a PlayStation, and we played that too. And they're normal kids.
Right.
They're children. And one of my goals in writing this thing was to highlight that these are normal kids, like
Yeah.
anybody else's kids.
Yeah.
You give them a chance and they're going to be bratty or annoying or fun or whatever it is. They're kids. Uh, and that's what's been taken away from them,
Yeah. Yeah.
that there is a possibility of recovery here. People don't have to lead circumscribed and small lives.
Yeah.
But we need a massive undertaking here to try to heal them. And that's not in the offing.
Yeah. So one of the points that Muhammad al-Kurd makes in his new book is he kind of argues that when one focuses on Palestinian children or Palestinian women and children, it has the effect sometimes of saying, well, they're the innocent victims, they're the good victims, but the men, especially if the men are fighters, well, maybe they deserved what was coming to them. And obviously, I know you don't believe that, but I'm just curious if you thought at all a little about the decision to focus on child amputees, which, and I could entirely understand why, but if you thought at all about that question, about the way sometimes people distinguish between Palestinians who are supposedly innocent and Palestinians who kind of deserve what's coming to them because they're not children.
I think it's an excellent point. I think it's a really powerful and appropriate point. You know, Palestinian men have a right to live,
Mhm,
have a right to self-actualize and
mhm,
to pursue their aspirations and goals and education and whatever it may be that they're interested in pursuing. In this case, I wanted to focus on kids for two reasons. One is I love kids. I think kids are great and kids are nice people generally. The second piece of it, though, is that what happens to these children
mhm,
will shape the future in profound ways. You know, some of the men who founded Hamas were traumatized as children in 1956
yeah,
when Israel invaded and massacred Fidayeen. My father was there when that happened. He's a 78-year-old man now, and he remembers it pretty clearly. He was a 5-year-old boy. Um, that point can't be emphasized enough. These kids are our future. It sounds like kind of a cliche,
mhm,
but it's a profound reality too. Now, as for Mohammed's excellent argument, I think we should focus on the plight of Palestinian men. And I think we should be willing to kind of wage the fight against the Hasbara, which will try to claim that these guys were somehow combatants. Um, we should have enough energy for that. We should be willing to have those arguments. And certainly I am. You know, the execution of the 15 paramedics, which I wrote about for The Guardian yesterday in a kind of angry op-ed, frankly. Um, that's being spun now by Hasbarists and propagandists as okay, sure, some of them may have been Red Crescent, but the others were terrorists. Well, you know, there are four-letter words you want to attach to that argument. So we should be prepared to, and we should actively seek to assert the right of Palestinian men to life. Um, This particular case, though, the kids, this has been a genocide which has targeted children, and I think we can emphasize that fact, even as we assert Palestinian humanity in all of its forms.
mhm. My last question is just that, you grew up, you are from Gaza. I imagine it must have crossed your mind endless times since October 7th, but particularly doing this story. And now you have kids of your own that this could have been you, this could have been your children. And so I imagine it was pretty traumatizing for you to do this reporting and write this. And I'm just curious, if you can reflect on what that experience was like, knowing that you are from that place, which has now been turned into such wherever, which is where such horrors are being committed.
You know, that's another reason I wanted to write this is um, what's harder, I'd say, is looking away. And yeah, there's a hair's breadth of chance. My parents could have made a different choice, and I would be in Gaza today. Same parents, very different circumstances. Um, the fact is, lots of my family is in Gaza, and and many of them have been killed with their children, kids I've never met because I haven't been there in 20 years. Um, but that reality, that awareness kind of suffused, and I'm one of my goals in writing this was to bridge, right? These aren't so my kids go to a local school and they have friends and they have a nice life, and their friends are they come from everywhere. You know, they're white, they're black, they have different backgrounds, and nobody looks at them and says, oh, these are Palestinian kids, and therefore they're not kids. They deserve to die. Um, And so in writing this, it's so easy to look at somebody waving the corpse of a headless baby, which is a video I saw on Twitter yesterday, and say, holy shit, but that's over there. No, no, that could very much, over here and over there is an arbitrary distinction in my mind, because of my relationship to that place. And I want to try to push that perspective. I don't differentiate. I don't see the difference. There is no difference. But yeah, I mean it's hard, and as a parent, you go through it, and you feel for these people. I mean the parents, the inability to protect their kids. I mean, one of the mothers told me real plaintively, like, he's my only son. And there's so much embedded within that. When you understand the society, he's my only son. I tried to protect him. There's no protecting them.
Yeah, yeah, which is every parent's worst nightmare, and every parent's deepest sense of failure in a way, right? Because that is you first, when you have a child, that's the one for me, it's like one of the first things that immediately hits you is that I now have this responsibility, right?
Oh yeah.
And it supersedes everything,
Yeah.
and when you're stripped of your capacity to fulfill that in even the most basic ways.
Yeah. I mean, you think about all the money we spend, the car seats,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
the,
yeah,
the the
yeah.
things that prevent the infant from
Right,
rolling around
right, right,
because of SIDS. And
right, right, right.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, that hit me at every stage of this process, and I hope it hits every other parent equally.
yeah, yeah. Well, I hope so too, and I really would urge people to read this piece and all the pieces that Ahmed has been writing for The Guardian, which are really, really important. Thank goodness The Guardian is a publication that is willing to publish these kind of things when, fortunately, some others are reluctant to. And so I'm really grateful to you for doing this, and I wanted to thank our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And you can also watch video versions of our podcast, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I'm Peter Beinart signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.